All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm still admitting a few people, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us for our very first Business Power Hour. It's the first of 2021, and we have a really exciting message to share with everybody today with a really special speaker. But before we go any further, I'd like to thank our sponsors. They help make these events possible for us. Our presenting sponsor is the First National Bank of Central Texas. And then we have our gold sponsors, BKD and Spectrum Reach. And then our silver sponsor, Educators Credit Union. Before I go any further, I will ask if we have anyone from the First National Bank of Central Texas on the call with us. I didn't see Dan Ingham log in yet. Okay, well, if he joins us, I'll let him say a special word or two. But we do want to thank our sponsors for joining us or for sponsoring these events. And let's move on to the next slide. Hopefully, you guys can see my presentation. I just want to put a few reminders up there for Zoom etiquette because we do have a really important speaker today. I suggest you view your screen in speaker mode. So if you go, I believe it's up to the participants. Let's see here, or the view. I'm sorry, it's over there on the right-hand side. You can view it in the speaker mode. And then I encourage you to keep your phone muted so that we don't have any interruptions, any dogs barking or trains buzzing in the background. I encourage you to type any questions in the chat box if you do have any. And then if you have to jump up and run to the other room or something and you on your cell phone, if you would just turn off your camera so that it's not super distracting while our speaker is presenting. But again, I want to thank you all for joining us. Welcome to the Business Power Hour. Our special guest today is Joe Scaramucci. He is a detective at the McLennan County Sheriff's Department, and he is going to talk to us today about ways your business can play a role in ending human trafficking. And I think it's a perfect timing for that because January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So, Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it from here.
Perfect. Can you still hear me and see me?
We can.
Okay, I apologize in advance. There's been some technical difficulties as the entire world implodes continuously through COVID. Up until about 3 minutes ago, my camera and microphone on the computer were still working. So I'm gonna have to have you flip through the slides. So first off, I just wanna say, thank you to anybody for being on here. I think it's very important that kind of shifting beyond even law enforcement and prosecutors that we discuss human trafficking, what it is, what it looks like, as a society, just so that we can all kind of work continuously to combat it. The overwhelming majority of what we do, we can't really do without the eyes and ears of people within the community. So I'm really glad everybody's on here. I straight up stole this PowerPoint from Unbound. It's more of a 101. I do more strictly geared for law enforcement. So there's going to be a ton of very basic 101 information on here. I'm very informal. I get that we're on Zoom, but if you have a question at any point, please feel free to unmute, start screaming at me, throw rocks, whatever you got to do, and we'll answer them. So first off, it is the beautiful beginning of Unbound. If you can, click to the next slide though. So kind of what I want to talk about just in the very beginning is what is human trafficking in the beginning? Like, what is this? We have some very strong state laws. We have some of the strongest state laws actually in the country against anti-trafficking work. But this one is the federal statute for it. It's just an overall definition through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And what the TVPA says basically is that sex trafficking in a commercial sex act is a commercial sex act that's done through force, fraud, or coercion, or where the victim's not 18. So we can have a commercial sex act that would be, quote, prostitution. But if that's occurring through force, fraud, or coercion, then it automatically becomes human trafficking. And that's really what we're out combating and trying to fight. Where it pertains to labor is, it's basically, if you look on here, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, soliciting, all of these wonderful things to employ people, and the purpose of that subjection is involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So it's basically forced employment. What we have to look at on our end, and this is where it gets frustrating, but this is the reality. If you can click to the next one, like I just did in my head, we have to have an action, a means, and a purpose, right? So we look and we say, well, there's commercial sexual exploitation, there's forced labor. That's great, but we have to prove the action and the means and how we got there. So the recruiting we see quite a bit online. We do see some labor trafficking recruitment going on websites like Indeed, Craigslist, any place where people would go looking for employment. We see it within Facebook community groups, things like that. But then harboring, transporting, all of those things, and then getting into force, fraud, and coercion for those forms of exploitation is what we're really focused on and what we're looking for. If you can flip to the next. So labor trafficking again, and this is where we see it a lot in commercial businesses, is when somebody's forced, lied to, threatened, coerced to provide labor or services. If you remember back a few years ago, we had the Vegas buffet case that was at Waco Drive in Valley Mills. And that was basically coerced labor. So you come here, I'll pay you X amount. We will, take care of you in this way. You can live in an apartment. Okay, so then people come here and they're paid, they're working 12 hours, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're paid $300 a month. They're allowed to live in an apartment that's stacked 8 deep. And within that apartment that they're living in, they're all paying like $200 a month rent. You can never get out of that cycle of debt. And that's really what we're looking for when it comes to labor trafficking. If you can kick to the next, the sex trafficking, we see this the most. It's really the most combated, and it's the most kind of in your face. It's what makes the news the most. It's when somebody's forced, lied to, threatened, coerced into performing sexual services. So we see this the most in the form of prostitution. Since COVID happened, we're seeing an increase nationally of forced, basically camming. So having the websites that people are using, the OnlyFans websites, things like that, and it's starting to shift to a more online focused venue. That's not to say that trafficking isn't alive and well. There was some thought in the beginning of COVID that trafficking would decrease substantially because people would be less willing to go visit a sex worker. But the reality is if you're going to go visit sex workers and your concern is not AIDS or getting robbed, COVID is not going to do much to deter that. So it really hasn't changed a ton. If you can click to the next, this one's really quick and easy because I don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion at all. If you're under the age of 18, for the purpose of child trafficking, I don't have to prove much of anything, just that you're engaged in those acts and that somebody is having you do it in exchange for money. If you can jump to the next, and then why do we need to know? On to the next. We need to know because it happens here, right? So what we have here is what's dubbed the Texas Triangle. And it's basically the interstate system between Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. So what happens is you maybe have people that are from Houston, as an example, and they'll post a sex ad in Dallas, and they'll shoot up I-45, they'll work up in Dallas, they'll turn around, they'll shoot down 35, they'll hit Waco, they'll hit Killeen, Austin, down to San Antonio, and then they pop I-10 back over. So you get a lot of transportation going through there. We rank number 2 in the country for calls to the national hotline. Those are geared for victims that are actually calling in. So number 2 in the nation. Of course, we're led by California because nothing good comes out of California, but we're right behind them on this. There's some estimates that say that 20% of all U.S. victims will end up in Texas at some point. So just looking at this nationally, we could be, I work operations all over. I actually am working a deal in a far east state right now, and I got hit up literally this morning by a 254 phone number. So that really kind of puts it in perspective of how intertwined this is. I-10 and I-20 are some of the most heavily trafficked corridors, so we obviously have that coming through. So can we click to the next? So who all's involved in this? Obviously traffickers. If you're gonna have trafficking, you have to have a trafficker. You're gonna have recruiters. So people that are out for, if it's sex trafficking, they're out looking for other girls to bring in. If it's labor trafficking, they're out looking for day laborers. They're looking for people that are at risk and vulnerable. And that's really the key to it, is the vulnerability and being able to exploit that. So, hey, you can come work here and I will take care of you in this way. When it comes to sex trafficking, obviously the buyers, huge demand. We target demand very heavily here. If you were to look back at most of the sting operations we do, it is to target demand, because ultimately we do have the other player being the victim in this case. So if you can click to the next, looking at trafficking, like what do we think about? Can you click the next slide? Am I frozen? Hello?
Hey, Joe, it's Jennifer. I apologize that my internet connection zipped
Oh,
in
okay.
and out.
No, that's
I
cool.
don't know. I don't know where I lost you at, but I'm back.
What do we think of when we hear the word pimp? So we'll answer that very briefly. The fedora, like on the back of my office back here. We think about, whenever you're ready. Yeah, so this is cool right here. So when we think about what a pimp is, right, we think Snoop Dogg, because Snoop Dogg's the ultimate pimp. We think about 50 Cent rapping PIMP, all of that. The reality is a pimp's a trafficker. We like to look at, trying to catch back up to where you're at. Stay right there, perfect. We like to look at pimps as like this big glamorous, like they roll up in, an old Cadillac, and they've got like the purple crusted suit and all the, the fedora and the nice shoes and all that. A pimp's just a trafficker. They're all equally as disgusting, and they all need to end up in prison. But that is what it is. So if you can jump to the next, this is just one that Unbound uses in training, and it is like the pick the pimp, right? So everybody likes to sit here and try to figure out, oh, I think it's this one, I think it's that one. If you can click to the next, the reality is all of these people have either been sentenced and or awaiting trial for trafficking. I do know that the one in the top right, the 12 life sentences, was one that was done here locally. That one was prosecuted, I believe, by Gabby Massey when she was still here. He's sitting in prison 12 times, so he's got to die 12 times. I don't think he'll make it past the first one, but we'll see what happens. The bottom left was one we actually assisted Freestone County Sheriff's Office with. That one was a female who was selling her kid to some gentlemen in Morocco. We actually intercepted her on her way back from Morocco. So if you can jump to the next, what do they all have in common other than being pieces of crap? Well, they exploit people to make money, right? That's the goal of trafficking, whether it be labor or sex. Both forms of trafficking is to do nothing more than line somebody's pocket with money. Finding the weaknesses, finding the vulnerabilities, right? So we think about COVID as an example. How many people's hours have been drastically cut as a result of COVID, especially very early on in the pandemic? So when you get to a point where, hey, I don't have money and I'm running out, that's a huge vulnerability, where then people come in, they find that vulnerability and that weakness, they lie, manipulate, force, and then ultimately they get into the trafficking because they're exploiting that vulnerability for their own purposes. If you can jump to the next. So who are recruiters in this? Really, it's anybody. We see a ton of different venues for recruiting. Like I said, in labor, it could be completely online. It could be at a bum recruitment organization down in Houston. We see sometimes where they're like a travel agency, but they're not. They're recruiting people into trafficking and then ultimately kind of sending them out from there. We see tons in shelters, bus stops. Believe it or not, bus stations are huge. I did an undercover deal at the Dallas bus station one time, and I mean, they're just waiting because you have people that are riding the bus. Typically, they don't have the money to go to obviously take flights, have their own vehicle, and the traffickers are just waiting there to get a hold. If you can jump, and then we'll very quickly jump. So how do they get victims, right? If you can jump to the next, one of the biggest ones that we see is the bottom right. I love you and I want to take care of you. The least one that we see is do what I say or I'll hurt you. You have to think about people in this case as commodities. So we have to stop looking at human beings as human beings. If I were to take a 2020 Lexus and sit it next to an identical 2020 Lexus and beat one with a baseball bat, and then offer you whichever car you wanted, everybody would take the one that's not beat to hell. The one on the left that's beat isn't mechanically damaged. There's nothing wrong with it. It just is not as aesthetically pleasing. So we have to think about trafficking in that regard. We always look for black eyes, bruises, chipped teeth, the whole 9 yards. And it's usually not there. Most of the time, it's that I love you and I want to take care of you. It's in the top right, I'll make all your problems go away. We can do this. It's always the husband. It's always the boyfriend. It's always somebody very close to the victim. If we can jump, again, just kind of touching on it, what they're looking for when they're doing the recruiting is the unmet desires and needs. Everybody wants to feel loved. Everybody has to have basic, human interaction. You have to have food, water, shelter. And if you are on hard times, that's when the recruitment comes in. If you can jump to the next. So what are our main recruitment methods? It's usually, it's romantic situation. Almost always I can, sit down with a trafficking victim, whether it be, a younger person or even an older person. And when we talk about the recruitment, it's almost inevitably going to be somebody that's romantic. It's going to be the husband. It's going to be the boyfriend. It's my boo bear, whatever we want to call them. That's generally what it is. Acting and posing as a benefactor, that happens. Job advertisements, we do see that again in some different Facebook groups. And the smallest one, you're cool, stay right there. You're cool. Never mind. The smallest number, as you see on here, is abduction and kidnapping. We see it all the time on Facebook. It drives me crazy. This is why I drink. When we get to the Waco moms in the know, right? Waco moms in the know. I was at HEB and this man was pushing a cart and he had ice cream, and I feel like it was suspicious ice cream. And he looked at me and kept walking, and I saw him on aisle 7 again. That is not trafficking. I was walking out and I saw zip ties on the windshield wipers. And when you go to cut the zip ties, they'll kidnap you. That is not trafficking. My favorite is there's peanut butter spread all over my windshield, and while trying to clean it off, they will kidnap me. No, if somebody put peanut butter on your windshield, you have really irritated them, because that is not even trafficking. That is, you have really upset somebody. One of the other big ones right now is you see it on Moms in the Know. It's like scribbled on the back of the car, 2F minus 10, and they're like, oh, it's 2 females under 10. They're marking it for other traffickers. Traffickers are generally ignorant people. They are not like some big network of organized crime that works with Wayfair to ship Russian children when you buy a couch. So let's get the whole abduction and kidnapping out of the way on that one. All right, let's jump to the next. So what are our risk factors? Labor trafficking. This is where it really starts getting into the business perspective. Immigration status, huge. If you can't I-9 somebody, you probably shouldn't be paying them. Recruitment debt. The one particular case we had a female that was brought ultimately to Waco. So she went from Waco, from China to Flushing, New York, which everybody goes to Flushing if you're Chinese. Flushing to Houston, Houston to Waco. You could probably get away with that for, I don't know, 7 grand or so. They literally charged this poor woman $88,000 for that trip. You cannot pay back $88,000 if you're making $100 a month at the end of the day. The economically disadvantaged, we see that. I mean, I think I saw in the news this morning, there's another train of Hondurans that are on their way to the US to cross the border. Politics aside, they're coming here because they are economically disadvantaged. And when they get here, that's a lot of times where those risk factors get exploited, because there are people that will definitely exploit that when they get here. Low levels of formal education. It's very common to come across people that are immigrants to this country, whether legally or illegally, and then have extremely low levels of education. And then primarily foreign nationals. Every 16-year-old kid who has a job at Baskin Robbins knows you have to pay a certain amount. If you don't do this, I'm calling labor, like all of those things, right? Foreign nationals don't really know that. When we look at risk factors for sex trafficking, homelessness is huge. We really see homelessness a lot in the LGBTQ community, because for some reason in the year 2020, 2021 at this point, there are 15-year-old kids that say, "Mom, Dad, I'm gay," and they get kicked out, which is just absurd to me, but it really forces a lot of survival sex with those kids. History of abuse or exploitation. I've never had a sex worker or a trafficking victim sit down and say, you know, I graduated from Harvard with my, master's in economics, and next thing I knew, I was being trafficked. I had a great life with wonderful parents. 9 out of 10 times, we're going to talk about the child welfare system. We're going to talk about sexual abuse as children. We're going to talk about all of those things that ultimately led to that. Substance abuse. We do see it. It's not huge, believe it or not. We don't have a ton of like heroin addicted trafficking victims in comparison to some of the others, but it does happen. Involvement in commercial sex. So strip clubs. If you go to strip clubs, quit. If you don't go to strip clubs, burn them down. But we see, a ton of it going on in those venues. It's a very target rich environment because people are already at risk. That's why they're there to begin with. And then mental illness, we see that as well. That leads into a whole nother issue, because then by the time we get involved, we're dealing with PTSD, complex trauma, just tons and tons and tons of mental health issues. Child sex trafficking, running away. You got a kid that's like a 9-time runaway, we need to go find that kid. We have to ask, why are you running away? That's the question. They're usually not running because they just want to go be out on their own. They're usually running from something. And unfortunately, sometimes that's like Uncle Touchy, who also lives at home with them. Again, the LGBTQ community, we see the developmental delays. We see that fairly often, where they're just a little bit, slower. There's more easily manipulated. Family dysfunction, low self-esteem, and almost every time involvement within the child welfare system. If you can jump to the next. So how do people get groomed? Parents call, right? And they're like, my kid did this, my kid did that. No, your kid didn't do this. Your kid is a kid. This guy did this. This is the system by which this is set up when you're a trafficker. It all starts with grooming. You can't just like walk up. I don't know. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, especially a female. I don't think I could walk up and be like, "Hi, I would like for you to sell yourself. And in exchange for that, give me all the money. I would love this, please." And they go, "Okay, sure. Like, let's go do it." It's a very slow process, and it takes a while, but it ultimately, it's because of grooming. So befriending. Hey, girl. I mean, I could probably textbook right down the line. It's like, hey, babe, you're cute. And then this guy, he's this, he's that. So they're just befriending. They're becoming that person that's involved in the child or the adult's life. The intoxicating doesn't necessarily mean like, hey, have some whiskey. It's that like intoxicating love that, he's Dizzy Whizzle is my dream come true. And then once that happens, then we start to kind of alienate and we pull away. And once we do that, we can get you now with a buffer between you and your family, very similar to domestic violence, right? You have to separate them from their family. And then you see the desensitization in there, especially in younger kids, primarily through pornography. And then, showing other videos and photos of other kids, and then ultimately capitalizing on it. So getting to the monetary amount. So this was actually done by John Clark with Operation Texas Shield. John's kid was actually trafficked in. When you talk about a very good home, they're very good people. So he's really big into anti-trafficking work now. If you can jump to the next. So where's this going on, right? That's the big question of the day. It's going on social media. That's the biggest. You'll see that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, I think in 2019, had 19 million cyber tips, right? You see that stat put out all the time. It's an arguably screwed up statistic, but the point of that is the biggest provider of cyber tips to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is Facebook, which means Facebook and the companies that they own, so Instagram and all, are the biggest contributor of grooming and the online discussing. We see it on gaming. If your kids are on the game, like mine, and he's like, hey, brah, hey, brah, hey, brah, not only do I want to smack him for saying brah 15 times in a 3-minute conversation, but that means he's having interaction with people that are, unknown to him. Just because your, online moniker is like Sergeant McCrackmuffin 5429 in Waco doesn't mean that you're some dude from Waco. You could be from anywhere in the world, frankly. But then we see a lot of the sexting. If you can jump to the next slide. If they have any of these, the concealment ones, you see quite a bit. Calculator plus. So this is one I always tell for the spouses. If you go to the storage on your husband or your kids or your wife's deal, and you look at storage space and the calculator space is taking a whole lot of data, it's because there's pictures hidden behind it. So sorry for everybody, but that's a really easy way on the iPhones to figure out if your kid's calculator is basically a hidden vault. The chatting, we do see some still on Omegle. One of the biggest is Snapchat. Snapchat's a devil. If your kid has it, make them get rid of it, or log into their account from your device and watch everything that goes on. Some of these are a little more outdated. Meet Me is one that we see quite a bit. Scout is as well, where they're having communication based on geographical location. Still connected to anybody on the internet, but if I get on Scout, it's going to show some people that are closest to me so we can continue to chat. So once we get through all this, if we can jump to the next slide, we're going to talk about demand. So when you think about demand and you think of who's paying for sex, it ain't Pretty Woman. These are the nasty people that are showing up to pay for sex. I've only ever had one that we arrested that, like, you could smell him and he had cologne on and had clearly brushed his teeth. And I just told him, like, on behalf of all trafficking victims, I want to thank you for your contribution to at least not being disgusting when you showed up. But this is what it looks like. It's everybody. It's all walks of life. It's obviously, through the course of our investigations, we've arrested everything from police officers to business owners and everybody in between. Can we jump to the next? And the question is on this, like, what contributes to demand? There are a couple theories on this. I left this next slide in for discussion. I've got differing opinions. So if we can jump to the next, it's the link between pornography and demand. There are some studies that show that pornography leads to higher demand. I don't know if I buy that. And what the theory is that if we question 100 sex buyers, 99 of them watch porn. Okay, that's fair. But if we question 100 people that watch porn, 99 aren't going to pay for sex. So there's that. One thing I will say is that it does shape sexual desires. We do see that often. In interviewing buyers, we often will find they're like, hey, my wife won't do this, so I have to pay for it. And some of them are some pretty disgusting things. Or when we talk to the ladies, we'll ask, like, hey, talk to me about this. And they're like, oh, this dude, he wanted to X, Y, and Z. It was crazy. So I can see where that contributes, but to say it's a direct contribution, it's kind of tough. If we can jump to the next, who are our victims? It really depends. And it kind of depends on the venue. The reality is anybody could be a victim of trafficking, either sex or labor. All it takes is one little bit of vulnerability and somebody to come along and exploit that. It could be a 60-year-old Chinese immigrant. It could be a 15-year-old Guatemalan immigrant, or it could be a 20-year-old college student from the nice part of town. It can literally be anybody. If you can jump to the next, the one that's overlooked the most is boys. I'm actually on a panel tonight following a documentary about male sex trafficking because it's so overlooked, and you've got, no man or no boy wants to be a victim of anything in life, really, but then turn around and have to admit to being the victim of child sexual exploitation is huge. So some of the risk factors that we see, like I said earlier, with the homelessness, the majority of the homelessness does come as a result of the sexual orientation. Hey mom, hey dad, I'm gay, get out. Why that's still a thing is completely beyond me, but we do see it. So the survival sex we see quite a bit. They are less likely to have a pimp. However, I will argue that people that pay for sex are, in a sense, trafficking. Even if it's somebody that's independent, they're only doing that because of certain vulnerabilities, and it's generally a last resort, and you're still exploiting that. But, that's here nor there. If we can jump to the next. So we'll kick back over to labor trafficking. What can we look for? Not free to come and go. That's a big thing. If the panel van picks everybody up at an apartment, drives them straight to the business, straight from the business back to the apartment, no in between, can't go anywhere, that's a problem. Social isolation. I don't speak a lick of Spanish. I don't read Spanish. More people do, so let me jump on that. If you were to take me and put me in the middle of China right now and say, hey, you have to work here, you're completely free, but the cops are dirty, they'll arrest you, they'll beat you, all of these things. You have to remember that not free to go doesn't necessarily mean concertina wire around a business. It can also mean I don't know how to read Chinese, so I don't know where to go for help. I don't know how to do any of that. So oftentimes it's kind of what they call invisible chains. Not being in possession of money, identification, or documentation. If you're filling out documentation on a new employee, and you get to the I-9s and you've got to go through the I-9 and get the license as an example, or passport, whatever ID documentation you have, and they don't have it and they don't have access to it, the FBI calls that a clue. We got a problem. So we really want to look at some of that. Working excessively long hours, owing huge debts, recruitment that's coming through false promises, lacking knowledge of whereabouts. I actually assisted with a case. We were in Ohio and we ran warrants on this place, and the lady was telling us she was in Indianapolis. Homegirl, you're not in Indianapolis, you were in Ohio. And she argued it, like, I'm not in Ohio, or I'm not in Ohio, I'm in Indianapolis. Had no idea where she was. One thing I will add to that in working with other businesses is what's fair market value. Like, as an example, I had one that was a trafficking venue here locally, and the guy was exploiting through basically like yard service. So, I had to go to legitimate services and say, hey, what would the cost of this be? What would you pay this person? And really get a set standard for what the rest of the businesses would be paying, how that would actually work out, what it looks like, because I'm police, I don't know. So if you do see businesses that are somehow coming in constantly, real low on their bids and all that, it may start raising some red flags. Like, not only are they exploiting people, but they're taking away from legitimate businesses. If you can jump to the next, when we look at sex trafficking, again, hiding a bruise with scars, marks, go back to the whole Lexus getting beat up with a bat. In this particular case, the female on the left had mobbing tattooed. That was Emmanuel Bailey's street name. Emmanuel Bailey sitting in federal prison. But is it common to have somebody's name tattooed? It is. Thank God I don't have any, but it is common. This was his street name, but she had mobbing on the back of the neck. She had tattoos everywhere that were him. So the point to that being, just because it says Dip Dizzy Whizzle on the neck doesn't necessarily mean they're being trafficked. But if they've got Dip Dizzy Whizzle in 15 different places on their body, that's kind of excessive. We may want to start asking some questions. We look at kids skipping school, running away, hanging out with different people. All of a sudden they show up with somebody much older. I had Susan Peters with Unbound said, I would be very angry if my child was 16 and showed up and a 30-year-old man knocked on the door. I wouldn't be angry. I'd have a 45 in my hand. We'd be leaving that porch quickly. So, just looking at those kind of things, the biggest thing is, and everybody likes to ask, what are the signs? There is no real sign that you can say. Know your kids. That's the biggest thing. Have an open relationship, know them, talk, and really know when that change happens. Can we jump to the next? So we get here, we're being exploited. Why don't they identify, right? You see this all the time. Waco Trip can put out a deal about somebody who was, abused. Inevitably, there will be some moron that's like, well, she didn't run and ask for help. Kind of her fault. That's the most idiotic thing I've ever heard, but this is why they don't self-identify. Fear of not being believed. Think back how many news stories you can see, and people are saying, well, she. You've got the courage to come out and make an outcry of this abuse, whether it be trafficking or any other form of abuse, and you're not believed? That's crazy. So that's a very good reason why they won't. Retaliation. We don't know that position and that dynamic. Being placed in foster care systems, we do see that quite a bit, and that is something that is really a barrier and a burden. The trauma bonding is huge. And then ultimately the lack of awareness we see. If you can jump to the next, kind of to add to those, fear, lies from the trafficker, hopelessness, addictions, just tons and tons of other reasons why. If you can jump to the next, what do we want victims to know? The biggest thing is that there is a way out. There is help that can move forward. Whether it be from our office, we very aggressively target trafficking pretty much throughout the country at this point. But there is avenues there. Organizations like Unbound, they're huge. I never do anything without them. I cannot stress the importance of that. That organizations like them, I tell people, everybody likes to say, well, the cops saved. We don't save anybody. I can identify you, I can turn you over and get you services with Unbound, with the Advocacy Center, with these other organizations, and they're the ones that really help you, not us. We just point guns at bad people and throw them in jail. If we can jump to the next, I threw on some hotline numbers on here. So you got the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Obviously, that is the one you can call. They're in direct communication with us. I will say there's a bit of a delay. Unbound's hotline is a local hotline. They're immediately in touch with us as well. And then if it's something that you just are suspicious about or you want to be very anonymous, that link is actually for our anonymous web reporting to the sheriff's office. If you do that, it is, I can guarantee 100% anonymous. I cannot, it's frustrating sometimes because I have more questions and I can't do anything. But there's tons of pull down menus. You fill out what you had. You can put pictures in there if you took any, and it will immediately direct that information to myself and my partner to follow up on. So those are, some easy venues. So my favorite part is actually question and answer. I prefer that over everything because I can talk all day about what's what, and unless you I answered something specific, then we haven't really accomplished anything. So if anybody has something, feel free, unmute, chat, do the chat box. I'm cool with whatever.
Hey, Joe, can you give us some local statistics like here in McLennan County? And
yeah, I can. So looking at it I'll start statewide. Statewide, there's some studies that show there's about 300,000 victims of human trafficking in the state of Texas at any given time. So that's also labor trafficking. So there's definitely going to be tons of that. There was a study that was published by the University of Texas at Austin back last year, I believe. Well, 2019. I'm still stuck on 2020, and it showed that there was an estimated 79,000 domestic minor sex trafficking victims on the streets of Texas at any given time. So that's 79,000 kids that are being trafficked in the state of Texas, literally right now. Looking at that locally, it's difficult to really do that. I believe last year, Unbound served something like 90 victims of trafficking. We, as a department, I know over the last 5 years or so, when we look at buyer deterrence, we've arrested in excess of 500 sex buyers locally. When we look at trafficking related offenses, I haven't crunched year-end numbers yet for last year, but I think we ended the year with almost 60 felony trafficking related arrests. So that's alive and well. So kind of unique, I also am cross-designated with Homeland Security investigations. So I assist with trafficking investigations on task force level, basically nationally, but our primary area of operation is between everything between Austin and Hillsborough. So we have worked several cases that were not necessarily in McLennan County, but that were directly attributed to what we've been doing. And assisting agencies throughout the country as well. I know last month, we ended out with numerous cases throughout other jurisdictions, working with those jurisdictions as well.
Thank you, Joe.
Yep.
Does anyone else have any questions they want to unmute or turn on their cameras?
If not, I'll just assume that I answered every question anybody could possibly have, and I'll get 5 stars on Yelp.
One last question, Joe. What can we as the business community, like what's the one thing that you would suggest that we be mindful of and we can help do to stop this?
Yeah, so I think that's obviously dependent on the venue. The beauty of this is that trafficking victims and traffickers have to live life, right? So they have to go to businesses, they have to go to restaurants, they have to do all of those things. So they're out and around. One thing I would definitely encourage, and I touched on earlier, is know what's going on within your individual markets. So if somebody's cutting corners and cost and all of that, obviously it's comes into a business issue, but it could be that they are employing people that they shouldn't be. I obviously can't give any information, but I mean, we have several current cases with businesses. So they are out there, and if somebody sees that and they're seeing what's happening, definitely report it. We can investigate it, and if there's nothing, we move on. The biggest one I would say is documentation. Whatever internal processes you have to document anything that you've seen, noticed. Again, depending on your venue, it's important because it's breadcrumbs, right? By the time we get involved, this has gone on for quite a while. So I need to follow breadcrumbs. And if it's something as simple as you run a business and you have within your business a money service business, so a money transfer business or something like that, say Western Union or MoneyGram or something, there's a lot of money being moved through there. You have to launder dirty money. So even just working with law enforcement when that time comes, like, hey, we see this guy every Friday at 6 p.m. and he's in here with all of these people and he's depositing their money into the banking institution, or this van pulls up and all of these people get out and they're all together. They all stay together and then they leave. Just some of those little red flags. That I guess the biggest thing is if you see something and it's like, hey, my spidey senses are going off, this does not seem right. you can still report it. It can be completely anonymous. We can investigate it. And again, if there's nothing to it, no harm, no foul. If there is something to it, it was great. So that's tough. I think there's no really set thing to look for. It's just paying attention to what doesn't appear to be normal. I always say the lack of legitimacy is evidence of illegitimacy.
Wow, this was fantastic. Thank you so much, Joe, for joining us today. And again, if there is any other questions, feel free to unmute or drop something in the chat box. But while we give them a few more minutes to do that, I just want to circle back and thank our sponsors. Our presenting sponsor is the First National Bank of Central Texas. Our gold sponsors for the Business Power Hour is BKD and Spectrum Reach, and then our silver sponsor is Educators Credit Union. We do record these, so if you know somebody that wanted to attend and they didn't make it for whatever reason, we will post it on our webpage, and that can be circled back. And it just happened to fall on a day after a holiday for a lot of people, so I think it was the Tuesday after a holiday was a little bit challenging, but the information and the presentation was fantastic. So thank you, Detective Scaramucci. We appreciate you sharing all that insight with us.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we will be back together next month for the Business Power Hour. And until then, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Thanks for joining us again. And I hope everybody stays safe and healthy. Thanks all. Bye-bye.